Hi, and welcome back to MR Realities. This is Dave McCaughan coming to you from, well, today actually quite cloudy Bangkok. My good friend Kevin Gray up in Tokyo and I have been putting together these podcasts for a couple of years now where we get different experts, authorities, people of points of view on different aspects of market research and its use from around the world to fill us in on what they think is the reality of their own specialty, what's going on in the marketplace, and where they think market research is going. Really lucky today to have a guest, Rachel Laws, who's a big expert on the way in which we use semiotics. Kevin, you want to introduce Rachel?
Yeah. So by the way, you're a Rachel and not a Rachel.
I'm a Rachel.
You're a
Hey,
Rachel.
hey.
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, CH.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I think American pronunciation. But anyway, thank you so much for coming. You're in Amsterdam this morning, and it's early in the morning for you, right? So thank you.
Not a problem.
Yeah. So could you just briefly introduce yourself? A lot of people will already recognize your name and may have even met you, people in the audience, but just quickly give us a snapshot of what you do, your background, so forth.
Sure, I would love to. Thank you. Okay, so I'm British, as you can probably tell, and I'm a social psychologist. And what does social psychologists do? Well, they're a bit different from the kind of psychologist that looks inside your head and discovers secret things, and asks you questions about how you were potty trained. So much of psychology is concerned with what's all this hidden stuff inside people's heads. Social psychology is concerned with how people interact with each other. It's concerned with their relationships with each other. And so that's what I know about. And when I say relationships, that includes people trying to sell things to each other. So that's really my kind of main background. And then my particular specialism, and a word that people would know in connection with me, is semiotics. And so I guess that's a fancy sounding word, but it really boils down to just understanding how people make sense of words, visual images, and other aspects of communication, all these building blocks of communication. And that's useful in its own right. And it's also useful because it tells you something about how culture has an effect on the way that people behave and interact with each other. So that's
Rachel,
what I do.
Rachel, can you just fill us in a bit? Because I'm interested in how I got interested in semiotics, but I'd really be interested. What was the point in time or the event or whatever that actually got you into semiotics in some way?
Thank you. That's a really nice question. So I was doing doctoral research. This was a long time ago, back in the late 90s. And I thought at that time that I might have an academic career, actually. And I was doing doctoral research using a method called discourse analysis, which is also something that I supply commercially. And discourse analysis is very popular with psychologists. And it can be used for, it's really good at understanding the kind of fine details of conversation, the mechanics of conversation. It's great with language. It's very precise about how people understand each other when they're using words. And because I was kind of a geek for research methods, I obviously wanted to know where it had come from. And I traced back up the family tree and found that semiotics was one of its parents. And I became very excited about semiotics because it had this enormous remit, enormous scope. So whereas the discourse analysts specifically focused on language and conversation, the semiotics said, we're interested in every kind of output of humans that there is. So when a semiologist talks about communication, they're talking about architecture, art, graffiti, pop music, YouTube videos, Twitter, you name it. If people are kind of making it and putting it out there, then people in semiotics will regard that as part of their data set. And for me, this was just irresistibly attractive. And so, I took up semiotics at that time. And then after I finished my PhD, I moved into the commercial market research industry at that time, almost 20 years ago now, and discovered that at that time, there was just no commercial offering in semiotics at all. So I started to offer it. And now here we are 20 years later, and it's now very popular and lots of people know about it.
Now, how
Yeah.
has, when you were doing your doctoral research 20 years ago, the internet or the World Wide Web existed, but it was still pretty much in its toddling. Now, flashing forward to the future, how has the internet and the web, whichever you want to call it, how has that affected semiotics, in particular what you do as a marketing researcher?
It's been fantastic, obviously, for data, because there's just unlimited amounts of data out there, and I'm never ever going to get tired of watching people interact with each other and posting memes and I guess kind of doing all this self-presentation activity. One thing that I remember quite vividly from the 90s, when the general public first started to have internet access in a noticeable way. Do you remember when everybody used to be on with America Online at AOL? And that was like the sort of internet provider of choice for North America in the early years. And I remember there were online communities formed almost immediately, and people were so excited about it, what they were doing, and they thought of themselves as being pioneers. There was this really strong narrative of we've discovered a new land, in a sense. It was like the story of the sort of founding fathers all over again, that we've discovered this new land and we're going to kind of, in a word, colonize it, and that we're discovering new territory, and that there's this enormous excitement about being the first generation of people to do this stuff. Now, where I see that happening now is with virtual reality. So I take a lot of interest in video gaming. I'm quite an avid video gamer. And I also do a little bit of video games journalism on the side when I'm not doing market research. And so I'm quite engaged with the category. And what I notice is that not every gamer has VR hardware. Okay, it's relatively expensive, and we're not there with, not everybody has taken it up yet. But those who have are telling the same story. They're very excited to be at the leading edge of technological developments, and they're well aware that games developers and software developers pay close attention to what consumers want to do with the products, and will then design for that. And so the consumers are very excited and very conscious of themselves as being able to exert an influence over what happens next. So that's where this sense of excitement and being a pioneer is still there, but it just moves forward to the newest kind of technology, whatever it is that we currently have to offer.
Years ago, I think I first came across the idea of semioticians when I saw, when I read first, and I just happened to read just before it came out. Do you remember The Name of the Rose, the movie?
Yeah, I do.
And I read the book and then saw the movie, and then I decided to, and remember this was the mid 80s, so I decided to find out who this guy Umberto Eco was. And of course, I hadn't realized that he wasn't really a novelist. He was the world's leading semiotician. So then I had to find out what semiotics was about. And I found a book of his essays, and this was probably in the late 80s. I found a book of his essays, which made exactly the same point. The essays were all about the primary leading edge cultural media cultures of the world at that time. And it was things like TV shows, soapbox operas and things like that, right? And so, but his point was and of course now, subsequently he wrote all these amazing books about Renaissance Italian art as being the leading edge of social media at the time, etc. But it's really always fascinated me the way in which this idea of semiotics is actually sort of like a rolling landscape that just rolls and develops as we see media change and the way in which people present themselves. Because I guess what you're saying is semiotics is really more about understanding the way in which people either present themselves or how they understand how other people present themselves, right? So
it is, and it's also about looking at, I'm really interested in how people manage problems. That's a huge part of what keeps me interested on a day-to-day basis. So, like, for example, I think Twitter is really fascinating because on the one hand, it's brought lots of people together and has created communities, and people who are fans of Twitter are very prone to saying how they're nostalgic for Twitter's early years, and they say things like, I've made so many wonderful friends because of Twitter and all of this stuff, right? But at the same time, as Twitter has conferred all of these benefits, it's also created a host of problems, right? With people being more available to each other than ever before, and now we've invented this whole new language. So just this morning, as a matter of fact, a friend of mine is having a few problems with what he describes as Twitter trolls. And so the troll is a kind of ever-changing idea as well. But it clearly, in the context of Twitter, it means somebody who's posting disingenuously, somebody who's posting in a way that breaks some tacit rules, in the sense that they're just kind of doing it to cause problems or to be aggressive or to be disruptive in someone's life. So I'm really interested in how people relate to each other and how they interact with each other, and especially in how they identify and solve problems, so that when something goes wrong, you can give a name to the problem. This is a Twitter troll. And then other people will then chip in with solutions, and they'll say things like, oh, we'll just block them and move on, and there's no shame in blocking someone. And you see what I mean? All this kind of therapeutic advice will sort of emerge, which we've evolved this advice quite rapidly in order to accommodate new technology.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I became acquainted with semiotics, at least superficially, through also probably in the 80s through linguistics, and also from a political angle. It was kind of hot at that time. But so, I mean, we have different, images starting off and all that, and flashing forward to, what I think I know about it now. But rather than me giving you some specific examples and saying is this a good way to use semiotics or not, maybe could you perhaps give us an illustration or two of how you have used semiotics for marketing research clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So what people should know about semiotics, okay, I'm not a big fan of jargon, okay, but there's a couple of terms that are really useful to know. So there's bottom-up and top-down semiotics, okay? So bottom-up semiotics, that tends to be the stuff that people know if they know anything at all. And it means things like maybe if let's say that we own a packaged food brand, and it means figuring out that if we put loads of green foliage all over our packaging, then people will think that green equals nature equals health. So what we're doing there is connecting visible signs like a green leaf to a meaning, which is health. And so that's bottom-up semiotics, and that's obviously useful for packaging, advertising. You can use it for scoping out what competitor brands are saying. So you can kind of prepare a kind of map of meaning. So you can have a look at what all your competitors in a given category are doing and say, okay, so these guys over here, they're using a kind of language of freedom, and somebody else over here is using a different kind of style of talk, which has to do with, I don't know, reclaiming your youth or something like that. So that's bottom-up stuff. So you're taking very specific words and images, or even sounds like Santa's jingle bells at Christmas time, and connecting them to some sort of meaning. But then top-down semiotics, which to my mind is just as important, and which connects to the stuff you were saying just now about politics, is these are larger ideas about, I guess, social trends and ideology and stuff like that. And so the way that will get used for me commercially will be on two levels, really. So sometimes brand owning clients will come to me and say something like, I actually did this project, a big household brand. The owner came to me and said, we've launched this project all over continental Europe, and it sells fine in France and Russia. It's flying off the shelves, but we just can't shift it in Germany and Poland, and we don't know why. We think there might be something cultural going on. And I had a look at what was going on there, and indeed, they were essentially kind of selling beauty, which was fine for France and Russia, which are cultures which are very outwardly focused and very conscious of what other people are thinking when they see you. that this message was not doing so well in Germany and Poland because they were approaching the category in a completely different way, and it had a lot more to do with exhibiting a kind of healthy appearance. It's not about looking attractive. It's about having a sense of responsibility and being responsible adults. So there's that. I can clear up those kinds of issues, and then I also do a lot of work with advertising agencies, and they love top-down semiotics. So they will, and I can provide a kind of short order service for them, where they will call me up and say things like, "Oh, we've got this brand of, I don't know, breakfast cereal, and the client is really hoping to convey a message to do with feeling of belonging, a feeling of safety and feeling of belonging, and can you figure out what that means and how to help us make the connection?" And then my question then will be like, if it's a British market, for example, what does it mean to feel a sense of belonging in Britain, and how would a British person know when they would belong? So you can kind of use semiotics to detect that type of stuff, which is probably quite similar to the sort of stuff you were talking about relative to politics, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think politicians, sometimes appear quite bumbling, but of course they have lots of high-priced consultants working behind the scenes to help them cultivate a certain type of image and to create these sort of associations from the top down. To do so, I imagine they have to also listen. They have to look at what's coming from the bottom up as well too. How well they succeed, I suppose, varies. Now you touched on culture there, and I would imagine that would be a massive issue. And all three of us have worked internationally for years. And one thing you consistently run into, I think it's subsiding a little bit now, a plus of globalization. But is that how come we're selling here in the good old US of A, but we can't move something in, Australia? Isn't Australia the same? I thought they were just like us, And
No,
I love Australia.
Remember, Kevin, we're drunk, not loud. So.
Okay. Well, I don't know how you manage to not be loud when you're drunk, but I guess it's your genes then, right? Okay. So how I mean, this is it goes beyond semiotics, but I mean, how can you handle that? Maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead here. Let me know if I am. But when you come across this sort of these stereotypes that clients have about other cultures, and when you try to explain to them that this really means this there, how do you handle that?
It's not as difficult as you might think. I mean, I guess if they were really entrenched in the local stereotypes, they wouldn't be asking me for my opinion, So usually the reason why they're even talking to me is because they realise that there's something that they don't know.
Yeah.
And then if we want to answer some questions about how do you do this kind of top-down analysis, I think the thing that's important to realise about semiotics is that it started with the bottom-up stuff. Okay, so semiotics really started with people in academia noticing that there was a connection between signs and their meanings. Okay, and it started out, I mean, there's a lot of different stories actually about where semiotics started out, so I'm just going to give you one story. One version of the history is that it started out in linguistics, and it probably would have sat there forever, except that shortly after the end of World War II, a bunch of people in anthropology noticed that there was something interesting going on in linguistics, and they said, look at these French and Swiss people. They've come up with this stuff, all these concepts and kind of intellectual products and tools for thinking, which seem to explain how language works. And indeed, the early semiologists had come up with these useful ideas like binary opposition. So this was the idea that if you look at the way people use language in everyday situations, they love to reduce complexity. They love to reduce a complex world down to simple contrasting pairs of things, right? So we'll talk about, I don't know, like Europe versus North America, or the weekday versus the weekend, or being in a hotel versus being at home, right? And these were very useful concept in its own right for understanding language. But what happened in the second half of the 20th century was that some people in anthropology went, wow, that looks really useful. What if we took some of these concepts like binary oppositions, and instead of just using it to solve problems about how language works, we applied it to questions of how society works and how culture works. And that's where it really starts to get interesting. This is where big semiotics really starts to happen, top-down semiotics, where you can then observe that if you want to consider like national cultures and things like that, and national identity and stuff like that, it will quite often visibly revolve around certain binary pairs. So, for example, like a lot of countries, and North America is one, Scotland's another one. A lot of places are very conscious of their own history and where they're headed in the future. So we've got this binary opposition of kind of now versus then. I suppose it's like nowadays versus olden days, you know. And what I noticed about North American culture is that it's kind of in love with its own past, and it's potentially trying to get back to some golden age that once existed. So hence phrases like "Make America Great Again." You know, like cynical people have been asking, "Wait a minute, when was it great?" Which, you know, is not for me to comment on either way. But just this phrase, "Make America Great Again," is very North American way of looking at things, which is to say that it's constantly reflecting on its own history and trying to pull something of this golden past into the present moment. Whereas if you look at Scotland, for example, that tension between past and present is there also. But okay, so the thing to know about Scotland is that obviously Scottish history is tremendously important to the country. It's only a small country. It's got thousands of years of history. History is crucially important. It's got spectacular castles lying around and mountains and all of that stuff. It also depends very heavily on tourism, okay? So it can't afford to leave its history behind. On the other hand, it's somewhat of a millstone because there's this kind of tourist version of Scotland, which is very difficult to get away from if you live there, right? Which is kind of, if you know, everything's covered in fake tartan, and you know, every second shop is a sort of tourist souvenir shop with, you know, stuffed Loch Ness monsters and this type of thing. It's really frankly annoying if you live in Scotland, right? And so what if you talk to actual Scottish people, which I did on behalf of a local bank, they're very concerned with asserting Scotland's place in the future, and they will talk to you and tell you a story about Scottish innovation and science and technology and banking, and they do things like they've built this fabulous, very modernist conference centre in Glasgow. Right. So what I observe when I look at Scotland and then at North America is that they both organise the way that they think about themselves. These nations they're both organised around this binary opposition of past versus present. And in North America, we've got this nostalgic yearning to almost return to the past, or at least bring something of the past into the present day. And then in Scotland, we've got this big emphasis on, can we please talk more about the future? And the past is something which we need, but we're also constantly trying to put a little bit of distance between it and where we are now. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I've encountered that in that strange dichotomy in a lot of countries, in the way in which it's sort of interesting, and how people. I always remember when I first lived in Rome back in 1984, and I was fortunate enough to live in a 300-year-old palazzo right in the centre of Rome, you know. And for me, as a born and bred, you know, suburbanite from Sydney, this was, oh wow, this is freaking amazing. Of course, you get to know a few locals, and I was in my 20s, and I got to know a few people in their 20s, locals. For them, it was all about, let's go to EUR, which is then the very modernistic business centre, recently being built in Rome. It was all about that. It was sort of like, we don't want to hang out with the old shit, you know. You know, because for them it was like, we need the old shit because it gets people like you excited, and you come in and you spend lots of money on stupid things like tourism. This is their mindset. But we want to be we want Italy to be modern and stuff. Now, unfortunately, that generation is now my age and your age, and it hasn't worked out for them because it's still basically an economy based on people going to look at old stuff. You know, and the only problem is that the stuff they built in the 60s and 70s now looks like it's really old as well.
You know,
know,
different kind of antique.
But the dichotomy is really interesting. Can you just give us an example of? You mentioned before, you know, you work a lot with ad agencies and stuff. So if you think about what you've just been talking about, what's an example of how an ad agency has been able to use that to, I don't know, develop ads or campaign or whatever?
Yeah, let's talk about, can do that. Let's talk about Scotland a bit more. So when I very first started out in business, one of the first clients I ever had was a bank, a newly merged bank, which is called Halifax Bank of Scotland. And this was the result of a merger between Bank of Scotland, which was a very much loved national homegrown bank of Scotland, and then Halifax, which was an English building society, which is just like another term for a small bank, really. And so these two organisations had merged. It was a done deal, okay, and the merger needed to be communicated to customers, and communicating that in England was not a problem because it was to be expected that consumers, if they took any notice at all, which they were not likely to really, and also they probably wouldn't have heard of Bank of Scotland because they had no reason to. And so predictably, if they were aware of the merger at all, they would just think, oh, that's good, you know. Halifax has got a bit larger, you know.
Yeah.
It's kind of grown a bit and become a bit more muscular and richer. That's a good thing, I suppose. But up in Scotland, it was a different story because you potentially got a very sensitive situation on your hands where you've got a much loved local bank, national bank, which people were very proud of and proud of its history. And suddenly you've got this kind of unasked for merger with this English bank. And it really could have been taken as, here's an English bank trying to muscle in, kind of force its way over the border and take over our national affairs. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And so communicating this in Scotland was a really, really tricky one. And so I worked with their ad agency at the time. They were at the time an agency called DLKW. And I worked with them to help them find some ways of communicating this merger in a way that was going to be acceptable to the public in Scotland. And I did a lot of different kinds of work. So I met a lot of Scottish people and had them tell me about what it means to be Scottish. And this is where I learned some things about these binary oppositions and what kind of annoyance factor of tourism and stuff like that. And I also had a look at what other communications had been released in Scotland with a similar type of message. Now, coincidentally, at the time, there's a fancy department store called Harvey Nichols, which is like super popular in London and very aspirational, you know. And they just opened a branch in Edinburgh, and people in Edinburgh were really excited about this, you know, because it was seen as somewhat of a prize. And just before the store opened, Harvey Nichols had distributed this brochure around the local area, which had this image on the front where a kind of tartan-like pattern had been made out of laser beams. And several the consumers I met in Scotland showed this to me and said, this is perfect. Because, as I said, people in Scotland get so tired of foreign brands just slapping a bit of tartan, or it's not even real tartan, just fake tartan check pattern on things, and thinking that makes something Scottish, and it doesn't at all, you know. And so what they really liked about the solution was that it took something which was very much, laser beams were seen to be a semiotic sign for technology, progress, innovation, science, all that stuff that Scotland wants to be known for, and combined it with this much older semiotic sign, which was the idea of tartan, and brought the old and the new together in kind of one seamless visual message. So I collected a few examples of things like that and shared them with the ad agency and said, this is what you need to do. We need to acknowledge Scotland's history, acknowledge where Scotland is trying to be and how it's looking to the future, and blend those things into the same message. And they then went on to develop an ad campaign, TV campaign, and poster campaign, which incorporated some of those ideas.
So, yeah, that's a really good, and I like the idea about, you take what was obviously an ancient symbol, or it's not really, the 19th century adopted symbol like tartan and stuff, and then what do you do to actually use it to get across a modern message to lasers? That's really a great example. Can you just talk us through the process a bit more about how you go about, because I think maybe I'm sure you've struck this. A lot of people, whenever I've talked about semiotics, or certainly as I try to sell in the idea to clients that, I know somebody and we should get them to do some semiotics, and they sort of, but that's just people looking at stuff. We can do that. Why can't you just do that? I go, well, I can do it to a certain extent, but I'm not a really qualified set. I can do sort of amateurish stuff, But if you could explain the process so people get it. It's a bit more than just you sitting around and looking at stuff, right? So
it is, and I've come from a social science background, so I'm quite picky about things like evidence. I'm not really a big fan of just making things up, and so I obviously take quite a lot of interest in other people's semiotics, and there's a lot of it around now, and people publish things on LinkedIn and on their websites and various other platforms, and I'm very interested in that because it helps to shape the market for semiotics. I kind of want my competitors to be as successful and good at semiotics as they can be, right? Because good semiotics means happy customers, which means more business for everybody, right?
Sure.
And so I want everybody to be good at semiotics, And some of the stuff that I see people publish is not necessarily that helpful. So I saw a piece that had been published by one of my competitors a couple of months ago, where one of their staff had written an essay about, it was a photograph of a celebrity. It wasn't Kim Kardashian, but it was somebody similar to that. And they'd written this quite imaginative essay about a single photo of this celebrity and drawn a lot of conclusions based on small details like this person's posture and how much jewelry are they wearing and what kind of tattoos do they have and what's going on with their hair and stuff like that. Okay. And it was, individually there was nothing wrong with these claims, but it was as an essay, it was very self-referential. So what I mean by that is it only focused on this one photo. It had the data set of one item,
Yeah.
And it didn't really make any connection to anything outside of itself. Mm-hmm. So there was no effort to really connect these claims to anything that was going on in the wider world. And what was interesting to me about that was that it actually received quite a negative response. So there were a lot of comments following this essay with people saying quite rude things, actually, like, "Oh, just get a life," and why would you be so silly as to think that you can learn something about a pop star from one photograph of them? Don't you realise that this photograph was carefully staged and it's not a candid shot, that they took themselves? This has been carefully staged and managed, and it's a professionally taken photo, and as such, it probably says a lot more about this person's PR team than it says about the individual themselves, and it just received a lot of negativity, and we don't want that, right? Because it just kind of reduces people's confidence in semiotics. And so, because I come from a social science background, I'm quite big on things like validity and having a big enough sample and stuff like that, So I guess the way that I would work to try and avoid that type of situation is that I'll identify what it is I'm supposed to be researching, I don't know, let's say like it's breakfast time, for example. I'm supposed to be researching breakfast. And what I'll do is look around for identify what market we're tackling. Let's just say, for the sake of a simple example, that it's the British market. And what I will do then is I will look around for items I can include in my data set. And by that, I mean any instance that I can find of a British person using the word breakfast on any platform. Any visual images which have been tagged breakfast, any photographs or video sequences. So it could be something like a sequence from, it could be somebody's family photos that they put on Instagram. It could be a sequence from like a popular British soap opera where people are sitting down eating breakfast and the action happens as part of that. Or I actually did a project like this. I took a lot of interest in British people go on holiday and talk about food, right, when they're on holiday, and they talk about breakfast. And one of the reasons for this, right, is because people are busy, okay, and the reality of British breakfast is that it doesn't, it's not very impressive, okay. People are rushing around, they're trying to get their kids out to school. Often adults don't eat breakfast, and they might just, you know, try and shove a bit of food into the kids before getting them out the door. And so it's all kind of a bit of a rush and not very nutritious and a bit disappointing, actually. Nothing like you see in adverts for TV, you know, TV ads for cereals. But this all changes when British people go on holiday, right? Because now suddenly they've got time and they will avidly go downstairs at their hotel or whatever bed and breakfast lodgings they're staying in and eat gigantic breakfast every morning, you know, and then kind of report on it to each other, and it'll be like a big part of what they remembered about their holiday. And so what I will do is I'll try and collect all of that kind of stuff is data. And so what I'll do is I'll try and collect really as many instances of people making visual or verbal references to breakfast as I can get my hands on within the scope of a typical project. It depends on the time frame, you know, but I might be able to amass, let's say, a couple of hundred, 200 or 300 examples of breakfast being referenced. And once you've got quite a big data set like that, I can then start to scrutinise. I'm not just looking at one single photo, but at the whole data set, and I'm looking for some patterns which are emerging, and I'm looking for some underlying dynamics, and I'm looking for some of those binary oppositions that I was talking about earlier. So, for example, with breakfast, there's going to be, like I've already mentioned, one which is being at home versus being on holiday. There's also weekday versus weekend, children versus adults. Then there's breakfast, which you kind of sit down for, versus breakfast, which is a piece of toast which you eat while you're driving to work. So I'll look for the kind of binary oppositions in that data set. And because I'm fussy, I'll pay special attention to outliers. If there are outliers that I can't explain what they're doing there, that means my data set isn't large enough and I need to introduce some more data. And after a while, I'll start to form some hypotheses about essentially what breakfast means, what it's for, what is its role in British culture. And I'll then try to find evidence against those hypotheses. You can tell I've got a social science background here. So if the hypothesis is, I don't know, let's say I've got a hypothesis that people don't really care about breakfast until they start having children, then what I'll then do is look for evidence against that hypothesis. I'll try to disprove it. So those are some of the processes that I will go through. And then eventually, if you follow this kind of practice, you'll end up with two things. Firstly, you'll end up with some conclusions which are fairly reliable. And secondly, very importantly, you're going to have a whole lot of visible evidence that you can point to and show your clients and say, look, I'm not just making this up. You know, I've got evidence here, which is it's a very transparent data set as well, which I think quantitative research often isn't. You know, clients don't want to do the number crunching, right? So one of the things I like about semiotics is that because this evidence is all very visible, you can make your data and raw data really transparent. And so if your client wants to have an opinion on how you interpreted it, you can enthusiastically invite them to get involved and say, well, come and have a look, you know, we can spread all of this stuff out on the screen or on the table and we can sort through it together, and you tell me, and maybe you'll be able to see some things that I haven't spotted. So it's a really good way to get buy-in as well. So that's how I do it, you know. Other people
Yeah,
have different techniques, but that's pretty much how I approach it.
Yeah, I mean, I always find it interesting. You know, as I said before, and I guess, Kevin, we've all had this problem that if we're advising clients on how, types of research and things like semiotics are really hard to sell. But what I've always found interesting is that those few that you do manage to sell it into, if you do it well, it's not really a presentation. What you end up is what you say is you end up with a session where, well, let me take you through it and let's spread it out and let's have a look at all this. And people get so totally involved with it that it becomes, they sometimes don't see it in the same way they might see qual or quant research in the traditional sense, because they don't get the same effect of numbers or quotes and things like that. But it's more because it's so immersive in the process of just look at all this. I mean, I remember doing an exercise where we, here in Thailand many years ago, for a particular coffee brand that was the dominant market brand. And we did an exercise because we were wondering why it was that even though they were the dominant brand, dominant market share, tons of advertising, everybody knew the ads, but consumption levels were staying exactly flat. And so one of the things we ended up doing was we took 100 hours of the most popular drama and soap opera shows on television.
Nice.
And we cut out every scene where somebody drank something. Didn't matter what they drank. So we ended up with 12 hours of clips of scenes where people were drinking. And then what we did was, then we analysed what were they drinking, what was the scenario, who were they drinking with, etc. And the interesting thing was, the coffee brand, I better not say which one it is, but it's pretty obvious who's the number one brand in most countries. But the coffee brand, we were doing tons and tons of ads that would appear in the breaks, and everybody in the country knew these ads about. Typical scenario was 3 young people in an office, pretty modern looking office in the capital city, having a hard day, couldn't crack the problem. One of them makes the coffee, they all share a coffee, they get together, talk it through and crack the problem. This is great, except that we cut out all of these cuts of every scene where somebody was drinking coffee in the soap dramas. They were alone and depressed. So what we figured out was, so coffee is actually symbolic of I'm thinking about suicide.
Oh, God, that's fabulous.
Right? Now, the first time, you can imagine, the first time we sat down with the client said, I want to show you some video clips. And you show them a few random video clips and they go, what are you showing us? Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to show a compilation we put together of, we're not going to show you 12 hours. We're going to show you 12 minutes and symbolize. But, we can cut to every one you want to. And we did this, and they sat there. They came for an hour, sat for 3 hours. I got totally engrossed in brainstorming how we're going to change this.
I really like this. I really like this, what you're describing. It's a really empirical approach.
Yeah.
I strongly approve. To me, this is a good way of doing semiotics. Just make you want to know about something. Don't just pick one thing. Make a big collection, make the biggest collection you can of whatever that thing is, and let's see if we can detect what's going on there in an empirical way that other people can verify using their eyes.
Exactly.
Well, I have stimulated in part by Dave's story there. I have about 5 questions I'd like to ask you, but unfortunately, we're running out of time here. So I think I need to turn our discussion back over to Dave. I think he may have one final question for you.
Oh, okay. So, Rachel, I have one question I've asked every one of our 30-plus guests on these podcasts. It's the same question I always finish off with. And the question is actually quite simple. When you think back again over your storied career and all the many research pieces you've done, what's the one question that you never asked that you wish you had?
Oh, wow. The one question that I'd never asked of whom? Of consumers, of clients, or?
Whatever.
I think that's a really good question. I think the one question that I wish I'd known to ask a bit earlier, I do it now, but when I first started out, I didn't know that you should ask questions of your clients about the political situation in their organisation. Because, everybody's trying to achieve something, right? And everybody's got an agenda, and people who work in large organisations are sometimes dealing with difficult and complicated politics, and your research might be a part of that. And if you don't ask, they're not going to tell you. you know, and I know to do that now,
that is
but
critical.
I could have
That
done
is
with
critical.
learning that 20 years ago, you know.
That's a great answer. I literally just a couple of days ago, I was in a meeting with a brand new client, or working with another little agency here, and we went to have the first official meeting, and there was the two senior clients we're going to have to deal with day to day. Their boss had arranged all of this. And at the end of the very first meeting, I was literally having that conversation with these two people. It's like, why do you think we're doing this? And what do you think is going to happen? You know, because that's when the real truth came out about what was going on politically and the barriers that are going to be there over the coming weeks, etc. So,
that's one of the reasons that questionnaire design sometimes can drag on for months.
Yeah.
Defining the sample, you know, and I try, that's a critical issue, and I try to, you know, as tactfully as I'm able to get at that. That's one of the most important things I have to find out, because no organization is politically free. I mean, it's always something going there, and it gets really, really messy when you have the client, and then you have an ad agency, and then maybe a consultant, and maybe, you know, you have many parties involved, and you're one of them. It can get really hairy, and you really have to know, you know, why are they doing this?
Yeah.
You know? To the extent you can get at that anyway. But this has been fascinating. Thank you so much. And I just wish we had another 12 hours. Unfortunately, we don't.
Now, and I will say, folks, to everybody listening to this, I know I've actually seen Rachel at a conference. It was an SMR thing in Europe a few years ago, doing her live act. She's really good on stage when she's explaining these things. So if you get a chance to see her at conferences, etc., I know you run workshops that are listed on your website and on your emails and stuff. I recommend everybody try go and have a look at some of the work that she does and get her to explain a bit more about it. Thanks a lot, Rachel. It's been fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.